Kaydee keeps checking Shadow's nest. Is she starting to treat Big Bear like home? For weeks. Almost every new chapter in the Big Bear Eagle story has seemed to begin the same way. Kaydee comes back. Sometimes she appears near one of the familiar lookout trees. Sometimes she is seen around the roosting area. Sometimes Shadow is already nearby. And increasingly, Kaydee has been showing interest in one location that carries more history than any other place in the territory. The nest. At first, that might not sound especially unusual. Young bald eagles explore. They investigate unfamiliar habitat. They land in trees they have never used before, watch other eagles from a distance, test food sources, and sometimes examine nests that belong to established birds. A single visit can mean almost nothing, but Kaydee has not behaved like an eagle that simply arrived once, looked around, and continued on. She keeps returning, and recently, something about those returns has started to feel different. Because Kaydee is no longer simply appearing somewhere in Big Bear Valley. She seems to be learning it. The trees, the nest, the roost, the roots between them, and perhaps even the daily rhythm of the resident eagle who has occupied this territory for years. Shadow. That raises a question much larger than whether Kaydee likes the nest. Could she slowly be beginning to treat Big Bear like home? The answer is not as simple as it may appear. And to understand why, we have to separate three very different things. Finding a place, exploring a place, and choosing a place. Because Kaydee may already have done the first two. The real mystery is whether the third has begun. When Kaydee first appeared around Big Bear, there was an easy biological explanation. She is a young bald eagle approaching adulthood. At this stage of life, eagles can travel between suitable habitats while learning where opportunities exist. There's a mountain lake surrounded by tall trees, open water, fish, and established eagle habitat would naturally be worth investigating. From that perspective, Kaydee arriving in Big Bear was not necessarily surprising. What made the story unusual was what happened next. She returned, and then she returned again. The same young eagle began appearing repeatedly in the same general territory. That alone changed the question. Instead of asking, why did Kaydee come here? People began asking, why does she keep coming back? But even that question may now be too broad, because Kaydee is not simply returning to the lake. She has been showing interest in specific places, and one of the most important is the nest Shadow shared with Jackie for years. For viewers, that nest carries an enormous emotional meaning. It is the place where countless moments unfolded between Jackie and Shadow. It is where they prepared for breeding seasons, where eggs appeared, where eaglets hatched, where food arrived, where storms were survived, where family life played out in front of cameras watched by people around the world. After Jackie's passing, it became impossible for viewers to look at that nest as just another structure in a tree. But Kaydee does not know that human history. To her, the nest may represent something very different. Shelter, structure, territory, possibility, and that difference is important. If we want to understand Kaydee's behavior, we cannot begin by asking what the nest means to us. We have to ask what a large established nest might mean to a young eagle approaching the stage of life when territory and breeding could eventually become important. And suddenly, Kaydee's repeated inspections become much more interesting. One visit to a nest proves very little. A young eagle could land there out of curiosity. It could investigate the branches. It could stay for several minutes and never return. That happens, but repeated visits begin creating something else. Familiarity. And familiarity is one of the quietest but most important changes in wildlife behavior. At first, every detail is new. Every perch is unfamiliar. Every sound has to be interpreted. Every resident animal is a potential threat. But the more often an eagle returns to the same territory, the more those unknowns begin disappearing. The eagle learns where the good perches are, where food may be found, where other eagles spend time, where the nest is, where danger might come from, where it can rest. And over time, a landscape that was once completely unfamiliar can become predictable. That is the possibility worth watching with Kaydee. Not whether she loves Big Bear. Not whether she has already decided to stay. Those are conclusions we cannot support. The question is whether her repeated behavior suggests she is becoming increasingly familiar with the territory. And there are several reasons that possibility deserves attention. Start with the nest itself. Kaydee has not simply flown past it, she has investigated it. She has spent time around it. She has examined the structure. At times, she has moved around the sticks and appeared interested in what was already there. Those moments immediately attract attention because nest interaction feels important. But we have to be careful. Moving one stick does not mean nest building. Touching nesting material does not confirm breeding behavior. A young eagle can investigate an existing structure without intending to use it. What matters is repetition. Does Kaydee keep returning? Does she spend increasing amounts of time there? Does she begin bringing material? Does Shadow participate? Does their activity change as the season progresses? Those are the questions that could eventually turn curiosity into evidence. Right now, we may be watching the earliest stage of something much less dramatic. Learning, Kaydee may simply be learning where the nest is and what it offers. But even that would tell us something important, because an eagle that repeatedly learns the same territory is behaving differently from one that is merely passing through. Now consider the trees around the nest. Big Bear offers countless places to perch. There is no shortage of tall trees around the valley. Yet Kaydee has repeatedly appeared around trees in areas already associated with Shadow. That does not automatically mean she is following him. Suitable perches are often suitable for multiple eagles. A good lookout tree is a good lookout tree whether Shadow uses it or not. But once again, the pattern matters. Kaydee has been seen near familiar lookout areas, around the nest, near roosting locations, sometimes beside Shadow, sometimes after Shadow has already arrived, sometimes remaining in the same general area for extended periods. When these observations are separated, each one is easy to explain. Put together, they create a much more interesting map. There's a map of Kaydee becoming increasingly familiar with the places Shadow already knows. And that leads to a different interpretation. Perhaps the most important thing Kaydee is doing right now is not following Shadow. Perhaps she is learning his territory. There is a subtle but important difference between those ideas. If Kaydee is only following Shadow, then Shadow is the destination. If she is learning the territory, then Big Bear itself may be becoming increasingly important, and that would change the story. Imagine being a young eagle approaching adulthood. You have already survived the most vulnerable stages of life. You can fly, you can find food, you can travel long distances. But eventually, wandering alone is not the only possible future. At some point, suitable habitat matters, not just somewhere to spend a day. There's somewhere that might support a territory. And suitable eagle habitat requires more than scenery. It requires reliable food, large trees, safe resting areas, water, space, and, for breeding, somewhere a nest could exist. Big Bear offers all of those things. It already supports bald eagles. It already contains an established nest. It already contains familiar perches. And unlike a completely empty landscape, Kaydee can learn about the territory by observing an experienced resident eagle. Shadow. That does not mean Shadow is teaching her. There is no evidence for that. But simply being around a resident eagle can provide information. Where does he perch? Where does he fly? Where does he spend the evening? Where is the nest? Where does he return? For a young eagle evaluating habitat, those patterns could matter. And perhaps that is why Shadow's presence cannot be separated completely from Kaydee's interest in Big Bear. Shadow's response remains one of the most important parts of the entire story. If every Kaydee visit ended with Shadow aggressively driving her away, we would interpret the situation very differently. Big Bear might still be attractive habitat. Kaydee might still want to investigate, but an established resident repeatedly rejecting her would create a serious obstacle that has not been the dominant pattern viewers have observed. There have been no repeated prolonged confrontations defining every encounter. Instead, Shadow and Kaydee have shared space. They have spent time in the same trees. They have vocalized around one another. they have appeared near the same areas of the territory. Again, this does not prove acceptance. It does not prove courtship. It does not prove that Shadow wants Kaydee to stay. But the absence of a clear, sustained pattern of rejection means the story remains open. And for Kaydee, that may make continued exploration easier. Every return gives her more information. Every calm encounter reduces unfamiliarity. Every night spent near familiar roosting areas adds another experience to the map she is building. And that may be the change viewers are beginning to see. Kaydee no longer appears to be discovering Big Bear for the first time. She appears to know where to go. That is a small distinction, but it may be the most important one. There is a huge difference between an eagle flying through a valley and an eagle navigating it with familiarity. A visitor may land wherever opportunity appears. A familiar bird may move between known locations. And recently, Kaydee's behavior increasingly looks less random. She arrives, she moves toward familiar areas. She checks the nest, she uses established trees, she spends time around Shadow. Then she returns again. Perhaps none of this leads anywhere permanent. That possibility has to remain open. Young eagles can become familiar with multiple areas before settling. Kaydee could disappear from Big Bear and continue exploring tomorrow. She could return weeks later. She could spend time in another habitat entirely. Familiarity does not equal commitment, but it creates the possibility of something commitment eventually requires, a place worth returning to. This is where the question becomes more interesting than simply asking whether Kaydee likes Shadow. Because Shadow may not be the only reason Kaydee is returning. Big Bear itself may have become attractive. Perhaps the territory offers food she can access reliably. Perhaps the lake provides hunting opportunities. Perhaps the high perches offer safety. Perhaps the established nest has attracted her attention. Perhaps Shadow's tolerance makes the area easier to explore. Or perhaps several of these factors are working together. Wild animals do not need a single reason, and nature rarely gives us clean answers. That is why the temptation to turn every Kaydee appearance into a romance story should be resisted. Her relationship with Shadow may eventually become important. It may already be one part of the pattern, but Kaydee's behavior could also tell us something about territory selection. And that may ultimately be the more fascinating story. She was born elsewhere. She traveled, she found Big Bear, and instead of immediately disappearing, she keeps checking the same places. That is worth watching, even if a pair never forms. There is another clue hidden in what Kaydee does after visiting the nest. She does not appear to treat the nest as an isolated destination. The nest exists within a network of familiar locations: trees, roosting areas, lookout points, the lake. Shadow's movements connect many of those places, and now Kaydee is increasingly appearing within that same network. Think of it like a map gradually becoming familiar. At first, there is only one point, then another, then a route between them. Eventually, the landscape becomes something the animal can navigate confidently. We cannot see that map inside Kaydee's mind, but we can watch behavior. If she repeatedly moves between the same places, that repetition may reveal growing familiarity, and that gives us something useful to monitor. Where does Kaydee go immediately after leaving the nest? Where does she arrive from? Does she return to the same roost? Does she choose the same lookout trees? Does she arrive when Shadow is absent? Does she use those locations independently? Those observations could help answer a question even more important than whether Kaydee follows Shadow. Would she still use these places if Shadow were somewhere else? If the answer eventually appears to be yes, then Big Bear itself may have become a destination, not merely the eagle who lives there. And perhaps we are already seeing the beginning of that transition. At first, viewers watched Kaydee because she was unusual. A new eagle, a banded eagle, a young bird with a traceable history. Now people watch her because she has become familiar. They recognize her, they know where to look for her, they listen for her calls, they notice when she arrives, and something similar may be happening inside the territory. Kaydee is becoming less like an unknown intruder and more like a recurring presence. That does not tell us what Shadow thinks, But repeated exposure matters in animal interactions. The first encounter between two animals carries uncertainty. The 10th does not carry exactly the same uncertainty. Each animal now has a history with the other. They have already shared space, already heard each other's calls, already watched each other move, already experienced encounters that did not end in major conflict. Recognition is not pair bonding, but pair bonding cannot happen without recognition. And territory familiarity works in much the same way. A landscape becomes familiar because an animal returns, again and again and again. The next stage of this story may become visible as the seasons move toward breeding activity. That is when the nest could become much more informative. Right now, Kaydee checking the nest can still be interpreted many ways. Curiosity, exploration, familiarity, possible interest in the structure. But if nest activity increases later, the meaning changes. Imagine Kaydee returning repeatedly as the season progresses. She spends more time at the nest, then she brings a branch. Later, Shadow brings material. The two begin spending more time there together. Their activity becomes coordinated. At that point, we would have something very different from what we have now. But it is important not to jump ahead. Those events have not yet created a consistent enough pattern to call a conclusion, and that is what makes the present moment valuable. We are watching the stage before certainty. The stage when every small observation may or may not become important later. There is also another possible outcome. Kaydee may leave, and if she does, the current story will still teach us something. It would remind us that young eagles can investigate habitat deeply without staying permanently. A nest visit would not have meant ownership. Shared roosting would not have meant a permanent bond. Repeated appearances would not have guaranteed settlement. That outcome would be scientifically interesting too. But if she continues returning, then each new visit makes the alternative harder to ignore. At what point does exploration become familiarity? At what point does familiarity become attachment to a territory? And at what point does a territory become home? There is no single moment when an eagle announces that decision. There's no ceremony, no dramatic boundary. Perhaps it happens through repetition. A perch used twice, then 10 times. A nest inspected once, then again. A roost chosen repeatedly. A lake hunted regularly. There's a resident eagle encountered over and over. Eventually, the place is no longer unknown. And that may be where Kaydee is now. Somewhere between visitor and resident, not fully one. Not yet the other. She can still leave. Nothing prevents that. But she also keeps giving herself reasons to know Big Bear better. The nest is no longer unknown. Shadow is no longer unknown. The familiar trees are no longer unknown. The roosting areas are no longer unknown. Every return reduces the number of unknowns. And perhaps that is the real story hiding inside these quiet nest visits. We keep asking whether Kaydee is interested in Shadow, but perhaps the nest is telling us something broader. Kaydee may be becoming interested in the entire territory, and if that is true, Shadow's role in the story may eventually become even more important, because if a young eagle is evaluating a future territory, the resident eagle occupying that territory cannot remain irrelevant forever. At some point, tolerance, partnership, competition, or departure will have to answer the question. But we are not there yet. For now, the most honest conclusion is also the most intriguing. Kaydee has found Big Bear. Science can explain why a young eagle might discover a habitat like this. She has repeatedly returned. Behavior tells us the place continues to hold her attention. She has investigated the nest. She has used familiar areas. She has remained around Shadow. Those observations tell us familiarity is increasing. What they cannot tell us is the ending. Not yet. That is why the next visit matters, and the one after that. If Kaydee continues checking the nest, watch whether her behavior becomes more purposeful. Does she simply land and look around? Or does she begin interacting with the structure more consistently? Does she spend longer periods there? Does Shadow join her? Does she begin carrying material? Does she defend the area from other visitors? Does she keep returning as the weather changes? Each answer would shift the story. A few weeks ago, Kaydee could have disappeared, and been remembered as another fascinating young eagle who briefly visited Big Bear. Today that feels less simple. She has already created a timeline. Arrival, return, nest visit, shared trees, calls, roosting, another return, another nest inspection. The pattern is still incomplete. But there is a pattern, and maybe that is the clue we should pay attention to. Not one dramatic moment, not one romantic interaction, not one stick moved in a nest. Repetition. Because wild animals reveal priorities through where they keep choosing to go. Kaydee has many possible places she could explore, yet Big Bear keeps appearing in her story, and inside Big Bear. The same nest keeps appearing too. So perhaps the question is no longer, Kaydee keeps checking Shadow's nest. Is she starting to treat Big Bear like home? For weeks. Almost every new chapter in the Big Bear Eagle story has seemed to begin the same way. Kaydee comes back. Sometimes she appears near one of the familiar lookout trees. Sometimes she is seen around the roosting area. Sometimes Shadow is already nearby. And increasingly, Kaydee has been showing interest in one location that carries more history than any other place in the territory. The nest. At first, that might not sound especially unusual. Young bald eagles explore. They investigate unfamiliar habitat. They land in trees they have never used before. Watch other eagles from a distance. Test food sources. And